start timing you after any thank yous you want to give. As you reach 10 minutes, Samira will hold up the 2 minutes remaining card. If you just acknowledge her, she'll stop trying to wave it in your face.
Okay.
There you go.
Well,
Whenever you're ready.
first like to thank Dr. Tamara Mendelson and Dr. Robert Anderson. Wow. Dr. Tamara Mendelson and Dr. Robert Anderson. They are my mentors. They helped me quite a bit on this. And Dr. Stephen Freeland, who's been so much help to me. Can't say enough about him. But we're all here for a capstone, so let's first start off with a quick thought experiment. I'd like you guys to look at these 2 pictures. Close your eyes. Raise your hand if you confidently think you could tell me the color of the woman's hair or the eye color of the male. Open your eyes. As I suspected, only one of you can do that. And my theory is that there's a body part that's distracting you from other parts. So I want to see how that is done with fish that look distinctively different. The male and females look distinctively different. What are they doing in this task? So my specific purpose to this capstone was to answer a question brought up by my mentor, Dr. Tamara Mendelson. If non-humans have a perceptual category of all members of their species, even if the male and females look distinctively different. So why do we need an interdisciplinary approach to do this? Well, classically, animal behavior has been studied by ethologists who use a biological perspective, and they believe behavior is directed by your genes, evolution. And then the other side of it is comparative psychology, who they use psychology, and they believe that behavior is governed by your development and cognitive factors and experience. And this point of view of mixing psychology and biology is not new. In 1963, Tim Bergen suggested that animal behavior be a fusing of many sciences, all concerned with one another aspect of behavior, into one coherent science. To show the importance of this, I've got an example of ethologist George Shaler. He went and just observed gorillas for a few years, and what he found was that the gorillas were unplayful, they weren't social. But then you have Diane Fossey who comes in and habituates them. She lives with them, she acts like them. You can see she's doing some grooming behavior here, and she finds the total opposite, that they are social, they are playful. And you know, it took a behavioral psychology understanding of habituation to live with them to actually get real results. But psychology also has its issues too. In cognitive psychology, we have models like the Bradley and Hitch that try to explain memory and attention. But these 3 systems they discuss, visual, sketch pack, central executive, phonological loop, don't really match up well on specific brain areas and stuff like that. To quote neurobiologist Collette and her colleagues, she claims that results obtained from cognitive and neuropsychological studies have not succeeded in resolving completely several important questions about the nature of executive processes, their relationships, and their cerebral substrates. However, applying biological tools should allow a more precise identification of their cerebral areas involved in specific executive tasks. So basically, adding a biological perspective about brain structures and physiology should just help these systems that are mostly arbitrary and explain what they're trying to do. Key concepts before we go on. Mate recognition is the behavioral response of an individual to recognize another as an appropriate mate. Mate preference is the actual behavioral response indicating that they want to mate with one individual over another. And species recognition, which doesn't really have much agreement on it, but potentially is a measurable difference in behavioral responses towards individuals of your own species compared to individuals of another. Psychology, we have positive reinforcement, which is the idea of rewarding an individual for a certain behavior would increase that behavior. and also mental prototypes, which are cognitive categorizations of shared characteristics in a given category. So you have a mental picture of what a chair is. It has 4 legs, it has a back. If you see something like that, you compare it to that mental image, and if it's close enough, you say it's a chair. Past work, in fish, the appearance of a hump, which is only seen in males, seemed to be used for sex recognition, but not species identification. And in Hawaiian flies, it seems the appearance of a big head, which is only seen in males, helps with reproductive success. It makes them attractive, but it's not something used for species recognition. So the way I tested this was I did a preference of a female to male conspecific or male of her own species to a male heterospecific or male of another species. And out of a 10-minute trial, the assumption is the side she spent more time on would be her preference. And then we would also do the same thing, but with that same female, with a female of the different species and a female of our own species. And then we went into a training period.
Training in this project consisted of a focal female being housed next to...
So basically, we have a focal female we did in the test we just showed, and we house her next to a male of her own species, but a different one, and a male of the other species. And during training, what we did is we separated the, we put a partition so she couldn't see the male of the other species. And I would feed the male, and when she did a behavior we saw in the preference test of her headbutting, I would reward her for that. With the group that we didn't train, the control group, we just basically had it so she could see both of them and didn't feed on a specific side. And after 2 weeks, we switched the male side so she didn't have a bias to just a side. And then we would do this preference test again to see how it changed. How this was interdisciplinary, I applied the bridging strategy of building a complex multicultural explanation, which is using tools from one discipline to help answer questions of another discipline. The way I did that was I used positive reinforcement from behavioral psychology to help answer a biological question of if these dimorphic species, male and females, look different, if they have a true species concept where they can identify both sexes. And then I also created common ground through theory extension, which broadens the definition of a theory to coincide with the definition of another theory from another discipline. The way I did that was I extended the biological theory of a species concept to being an example of a mental prototype for the species. So the results, as expected for the group we didn't train, the control group, before and after training, preference for females did not change significantly. Males before and after, preference did not change significantly, all as expected. But the trained group, this is where it gets interesting, is the group that we trained for male preference did not change significantly before and after training. However, female preference did increase very significantly. And that's weird because that's not what we trained for. So what does this all mean? Well, since the training for male the same species attention did generalize, it extended to females, we didn't train for that, this species must have a true species concept. They must be able to identify that those two sexes are the same species, or else female preference wouldn't have changed. And then the reason why I think the male preference did not increase is that I wasn't actually rewarding for male attention. I was actually rewarding for the prototype of the species attention. And the idea there is that this prototype does not have many of those male traits. And this suggests that perhaps these exaggerated traits are more distractors, and they are used for mate attraction and sex identification. And also that without using a multicultural explanation or theory extension, this capstone might not have been possible. Future directions, I studied this in females. Well, how is it in males? Do males maybe have a perceptual category that is mostly male traits, and those female traits aren't there? Would maybe if we train them, they would actually have an increase in both male and female preference? I don't know. Also, we did this in fish, so how does this work in mammals? You know, would this actually work in humans? Is this what's going on there, or is it different? And that's all I got. Are there any questions? All right,
So I'm going to lead off and say that there's a lot there you covered that as non-biologists we might not realise is unknown. What's the state of play that you were really addressing here? What do we know about how females attract or pick males, fish, animals, life in general?
Well, the idea is that they look at specific traits, and I guess I should have gone more in depth about that. And so what I was also trying to see is that if these secondary sexual characteristics, the fins of the males, the colorations, if those are what the females are actually using, and that's what I was testing, because there's a lot of things they're using, and I was trying to also narrow it down to what.
But sorry, if I asked it just, and I don't want to hog the time, but is there another species of fish for which something has been clearly established along these lines, or do we just not know?
Well, the cichlids, as I talked about before, I just referred to them as fish. There's all the males have this big hump on their head.
Sorry, yep, I'm remembering that now.
And that what they were doing is that was not used to say, oh, you're a member of my species. It was used to say, oh, you're attractive.
Right. Yeah. And then the only other example was the flies, where the reverse was true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So in that study, with the other study with the cichlids, did the researchers use just fish with a hump, or did they use cichlids with the hump?
What they did was they had cichlids with the hump, and then they did a hybrid, which also had the hump. And what they did is they said, all right, there's no significant difference between the preference of these two. So if they're both like the hump, and it's in two separate species, the idea is that it must not be used for species identification, or else there would be a difference in that preference.
So, as we talked about before, you know, I have sort of this, I'm very interested in the idea of species. How do we know that they species identify at all, right? So, the presumption is that the fish species identify.
Yes.
How do we know that the fish species identify?
Well, because if they didn't identify, it would be very costly to them. The assumption is that when you mate with someone that's not your species, you create a hybrid that is not able to reproduce, which is totally bad for any individual, because the whole point is to pass down your genes generation to generation. If your child cannot reproduce, then your genes aren't going anywhere, so that's costly. The idea is that they wouldn't do this, and we see because there aren't a ton of hybrids that can't reproduce.
So then let me help Eric. Sorry, we're like left and right, we're hounding you down. Do these species hang out in the same rivers? Is that a real danger for these fish?
No, they are actually geologically isolated. One of the fish that I was mostly studying, the splendens, they are in more of a, they're in like a northern region of Thailand, and they're more in streams, and they're not even connected to the streams that the other group is, the bettas, which are in the southern part, and they're in streams too, but they're not connected.
All right, so two for them, and then I promise I'll shut up for a bit. But these two never meet. Would you expect there to be a legacy then of distinguishing the non-species, given that you're never going to happen in nature? Would you expect that to be in the brain? And does your expectation come from psych, or from bio, or from a bit of both? Or?
Well, we would expect that, there is literature that says that they can reproduce, and I'm not sure what this, if they are viable, if they can reproduce again. But there's a theory that when you have this geographical isolation between one species and they branch out, the idea is that the actual behavior of wanting to reproduce goes away before the capability.
So, I'm sorry, to follow on here. How do we know that what the fish aren't doing is mate identification and not species identification? I mean, it seems like there's this, I don't know what, it's not clear to me what the difference is. So I can see fish doing predator identification, they can, sort of other kind of competition identification, mate identification. Why do we have to call it species identification, I guess is the question.
Well, first, like I said, the mate recognition is the behavioral response of an individual that recognizes another as appropriate mate.
Right.
And species recognition, the definition I'm going by, is a measurable difference in behavioral responses towards individuals of their own species compared to the other species. So, back to the example of the fish with the humps, if they weren't using the humps to identify species, then if they weren't using it to identify for species, then we should see that that there's a difference in preference. Since the preference is exactly the same for the hybrid and that, we assume that they're not using that trait to distinguish it. It's got to be some other trait.
Any other questions?
Yes.
So I thought it was cool how you control the experiment, and I'm just curious if you were thinking about doing this with one tank, like one fish tank with two species, or with either that or changing another variable, which would be having like maybe two males in the same tank separated or something. I'm just curious what you thought about.
Well, the problem is with this species, we would have to use a different one. They're extremely aggressive. If you've got two males in the same tank, they're going to kill each other. That's just what they're going to do, and ethically, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But, yes, we were considering in the beginning to have one tank that had sort of glass dividers so they were all still in the same water to have olfaction, the smell to be part of, maybe that's what they're using. But it was just, we didn't have the equipment to do that. To do that, we'd also have to house them in one tank, and we only have so much room on that system. So logistically, we just couldn't do it. That would be very interesting, see how smell would influence that. Maybe that is what they're using to determine if they're in species. Maybe more so than visual, we don't know.
If there's really no other, let me give you one more that's much more speculative. What's your sense that we can be confident we aren't falling into a sort of classic trap of interpreting in human terms what's going on? Do you know that olfaction, do you know that sound, do you know that fish isn't experiencing such an alien fishy world that your experiment really works? What would be your defense that we're interpreting all this correctly?
Can you say that again?
You've put on an interpretation of the behaviour and what's going on. Can you tell me anything about what makes you confident that we're not over-interpreting from a human perspective what we're seeing? That there isn't anything fundamentally different the fish is doing?
Well, for one thing, I didn't put it in here, maybe I hope this answers your question, is that statistically we found that size has nothing to do with it. So even though the splendens, one of these species tend to be bigger, when we took that out, it didn't affect anything.
Right.
So we know it's not size, and we've also looked at the colors. The colors we trained on, the colors of the specific individuals, and what we found out is colors not really doing anything either. It's not that we trained them to prefer a male that's blue, and they're all of a sudden preferring blue males and blue females. No, it's just they're preferring that species. So we've taken out these other variables to consider that, and also during the training we switch sides, so we know it's not, oh, they prefer the right side, it's they prefer male of this species or female of that species.
Okay, now, thank you. Well, thank you ever so much for rounding out, and thank you to mentors and supporters who've made such an interesting